December 1944. Patton's headquarters, Luxembourg City. Snow falls heavily outside the heavy stone windows of a requisitioned administrative building, dusting the hoods of parked military jeeps. Inside, wood smoke fills the cold air as clerks clack away on typewriters, processing the relentless paperwork of an army locked in combat. A supply sergeant walks through the doorway, carrying a small, plain wooden box containing the personal effects of an American soldier killed that very morning in the freezing mud of the Ardennes. Inside the box sits a wedding ring, a creased photograph of a smiling young woman in a white dress, and a single sheet of paper with an unfinished letter that stops mid-sentence. The standard procedure for these items is clear, fast, and entirely unfeeling. But this specific box will never see the inside of a standard bureaucratic mail pouch. This is the story of what the general did when no one was watching, transforming a cold bureaucratic notification into a lasting testament of a fallen soldier's love. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Private First Class James O'Connor was 26 years old. He came from the grit and soot of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he worked the steel mills before the draft board called his name. He left behind a small apartment, a steady paycheck, and a young bride named Margaret, whom he had married just 2 short years prior. O'Connor belonged to the 26th Infantry Division, a unit that had marched through the mud of France and was now freezing in the dense woods of the Ardennes. He was not a career soldier. He did not seek medals or glory. He wrote home twice a week, every week, filling cheap notebook paper with descriptions of European churches and promises of a quiet life after the war. A sudden blast from a German mortar shell at exactly 7:30 in the morning ended those dreams permanently, leaving his gear scattered in the snow and his final letter home forever incomplete. The antagonist in this moment was not a person, but an unfeeling system. Captain Arthur Vance was 34 years old, born into a wealthy banking family in Boston, Massachusetts, and served as the division's rear echelon logistics coordinator. Vance wore a perfectly tailored wool overcoat, boasted immaculate polished leather boots, and rarely stepped foot near the actual firing line. His job was to process the dead, a task he approached with the cold efficiency of an accountant balancing a corporate ledger. To Vance, a dead infantryman was simply a serial number to be struck from the active rations list. He believed the military functioned best when emotions were entirely removed from daily operations. His philosophy was simple: the dead are dead, and standard procedures exist to keep the living from wasting valuable time on sentimentality. He looked at the smooth wedding ring and the photograph of the smiling girl with complete indifference, preparing to dump them into a standard brown paper envelope. By the winter of 1944, the European theater of operations had devolved into a grueling war of attrition. The rapid Allied advance that had characterized the breakout from Normandy during the summer months had completely stalled against the German border defenses. Supply lines were stretched across hundreds of miles of ruined infrastructure, leaving frontline units desperately short of fuel, winter clothing, and basic ammunition. The sudden and massive German counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest caught the Allied command by surprise, plunging the entire region into chaotic, bloody combat under freezing temperatures. In this high-stakes environment, military efficiency was prioritized above all else. Every aspect of the Army's administrative machine was geared toward maintaining combat numbers, moving supplies forward, and clearing the wreckage of previous engagements as quickly as possible. With hundreds of casualties arriving at collection points every single day, the process of handling deceased personnel had become completely mechanical. Division headquarters were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paperwork required to log names, cross-reference serial numbers, and verify next-of-kin details. Most commanding officers simply did not have the hours or the staff to spare for personal touches, letting the processing teams handle the dead according to the rigid regulations of the field manual. Individual lives were routinely reduced to a set of stamped documents and a standard-issue condolence text that offered little real comfort to grieving families back home. It was an accepted reality of mass warfare, a necessary coldness designed to keep the command structure from collapsing under the weight of collective grief. But inside the headquarters in Luxembourg City, the arrival of a single unfinished letter was about to disrupt this factory line approach to human loss. Captain Vance sat behind his sturdy oak desk, stamping death certificates with rhythmic thuds. A division courier, Sergeant Frank Miller, stood before him, holding the small wooden box. Miller cleared his throat, holding out the box toward the officer. He requested that this particular box receive a personal letter from the commanding officer instead of the usual mimeographed form. He explained that the soldier had left a letter, unfinished mid-sentence, to his wife. Vance did not look up from his ledger. He told the sergeant that the Army does not have a department for unfinished letters. He stated that the dead are processed according to the regulations, and regulations dictate a standard envelope. Miller stepped closer to the desk. Placing the box directly on the clean blotter, he asked the captain to look at the wedding ring, noting it was worn smooth from years of wear, showing how much the man had cared. He urged that a form letter would break the widow's heart. Vance finally stopped his stamp, leaning back in his leather chair and smoothing his clean wool uniform. He told Miller that sentimentality does not win wars. He explained that Private O'Connor was just one casualty among thousands in the Ardennes. He stated that his office would not waste time writing beautiful essays for every grieving civilian in America. He ordered the sergeant to put the items in the standard brown envelope and send them through the regular mailing channels immediately. Miller refused to pick up the box. He stated that he could not let a brave infantryman who died in the mud be treated like a piece of broken machinery. He insisted that someone higher up needed to see the letter. Vance stood up, his face hardening, as he looked down at the sergeant. He asked if Miller was questioning his direct orders. He stated that his administrative authority was absolute in this headquarters. He declared that ordinary soldiers and their wives must accept the cold reality of military life without demanding special treatment from the command. Miller saluted stiffly, took the wooden box back into his arms, and walked out of the room without another word. He marched directly down the hallway to the Supreme Commander's office to report the interaction. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the curb with a sharp screech of rubber against frozen slush, the bright 4 stars on his helmet catching the gray winter light, and the polished ivory grips of his revolvers resting tightly against his hips. The general walked into the administrative building, unannounced, his boots striking the floorboards like pistol shots. Everyone in the large office registered his presence instantly, freezing mid-motion as the clatter of typewriters suddenly died into total silence. Patton walked directly to the desk where the logistics coordinator sat. He did not raise his voice. He looked down at the officer and asked if the captain had refused to process the personal effects of an infantryman killed this morning. Vance stood at attention, his voice tight. He stated that he had simply ordered the items to be sent through the standard channels according to regulation. Patton asked if the captain believed an unfinished letter to a soldier's wife was merely a piece of standard Army paperwork. Vance replied that with thousands of casualties, the command could not afford to deviate from the prescribed manual for individual cases. Patton looked at the smooth wedding ring resting inside the wooden box. He stated that this army is not a factory, and its men are not pieces of scrap metal. He noted that when a man gives his life in combat, he gives everything he has, and his final thoughts are the property of the nation, not a bureaucratic filing system. He explained that a commander who cannot respect the love a soldier bears for his family is not fit to wear the uniform of the United States. He stated that bureaucracy exists to serve the fighting man, not to bury his humanity under a mountain of brown paper envelopes. He looked directly into the captain's eyes and gave him a choice. He told Vance that he would either sit at this desk and handwrite a personal, respectful letter to the widow, or he would be stripped of his administrative rank and transferred to an active frontline rifle company in the Ardennes before nightfall. Patton stated that if the captain found the emotions of the dead too tedious for his office, he could experience the reality of the dying in the snow. Vance went entirely pale, his hands shaking slightly against the edge of his clean desk. He looked at the fierce expression of the general and chose to remain at his post. The general stepped back from the oak desk, his expression remaining cold and fixed as he watched the logistics coordinator reach for a fresh sheet of official military stationery. Captain Vance pulled a black fountain pen from his pocket, his fingers visibly trembling against the smooth ink barrel as he placed the nib to the paper. Under the watchful glare of the four-star general, the captain began to write by hand, spelling out each word with slow, agonizing deliberation. He wrote directly to Margaret O'Connor, explaining that her husband had died bravely in action that very morning while carrying an unfinished letter meant for her comfort. He detailed the condition of the smooth wedding ring, acknowledging that its worn surface proved the profound depth of the fallen soldier's love. Patton stood over the desk in complete silence until the last line was finished and signed, ensuring that no mechanical bureaucracy would touch the message. The general then took the handwritten letter, the unfinished note from the battlefield, and the golden ring, placing them carefully into a polished wooden box rather than a standard brown envelope. He addressed the package himself and handed it to his aide with strict orders to bypass all regular shipping channels, ensuring that the personal offering would bypass the unfeeling processing line entirely. Margaret O'Connor received the polished wooden box exactly 8 days later at her home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She kept General Patton's handwritten letter, the unfinished note from the front lines, and her husband's smooth golden ring in her bedside drawer for the rest of her life, reading the words whenever the winter cold reminded her of December 1944. She never remarried, living quietly in the same brick apartment building until her peaceful passing in the year 1998. Captain Arthur Vance survived the war, but found his military career effectively ruined by the official reprimand on his permanent record. He returned to Boston, Massachusetts in late 1945 and went back to the banking industry, though colleagues noted he had become an extremely quiet, almost reclusive man who avoided administrative leadership roles. He lived out his remaining years in complete obscurity, never speaking to his family or peers about his time in Luxembourg City, before dying of heart failure in 1974. General George S. Patton Jr. never recorded this specific incident in his official diaries, nor did he mention the logistics coordinator in his public wartime speeches. However, a single personal letter addressed to his wife Beatrice, recovered decades later from his family archives, contained a brief reflection written on the night of the encounter. He wrote that an army which forgets how to love its families will eventually forget how to fight for its country, and that true leadership is often measured by the things a commander does when no one is watching. Some historians argue that Patton's intervention in the administrative process was an unnecessary distraction from his vital duties as a field commander during a critical phase of the Ardennes campaign. They suggest that military efficiency must remain entirely objective to prevent the emotional collapse of the command structure during high-casualty operations. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that his actions demonstrated the true essence of battlefield leadership by preserving the human dignity of the soldiers who were sacrificing everything on the front lines. What is certain is that the handwritten letter survived as a definitive historical artifact, providing a rare glimpse into the unexpected empathy of an otherwise notoriously ruthless general. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have taken the time to handwrite that letter? Or would you have allowed the standard military bureaucracy to handle the notification? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.